What Windows startup programs do I need? Boy, I wish that I had a definitive answer for this one. I really do. It's a very common question, particularly as machine gets older or slower or whatnot. People are looking for ways to improve their performance, and by improving their speed, their startup time, they're hoping that they can just make the machine more usable and last longer. Do they really need everything? Unfortunately, it's not a question I can answer. I'll point you at some of the resources you have to do a little bit of research on your own to decide what you do and perhaps don't need at startup. What Windows startup programs do I need? Windows startup is a complex process, further complicated by the number of programs that add themselves to the list. Paring it down takes work. I'm Leo Notenboom. This is askleo.com. Question: how do I determine what Windows startup programs I absolutely need to load? Do I really need all of my protection programs like virus and spyware to load at startup? Ultimately, this is an unanswerable question. For many Windows startup programs, the answer will be, I don't know. But there are definitely steps you can take to understand much of what is happening at startup and make a few decisions. Everyone's different. There simply is no single answer. There is no minimum set of startup programs that I can list here that would work for everyone. Every machine is different, everyone has different software installed, and everyone has different ideas of what is and is not important. Instead, I'll give you an overview of the steps I take to manage startup. Task Manager Startup. The first place to turn to is the Startup tab in Task Manager. Right-click on the taskbar clock, click on Task Manager, click on More Details if present, and then click on the Startup tab. In prior versions of Windows, you can run the msconfig utility for a similar list. For example, here's an image of what I see when I run it on my primary Windows 10 Pro system. Yes, I'm a power user and have many entries in my startup. You may have fewer, or perhaps even more. The key is not what's on my list, but how to evaluate what's on yours. Evaluating startup entries. For each entry in the list, ask yourself, is this something I use? If not, consider uninstalling the software completely rather than just worrying about the startup entry. Is this something that needs to run at startup? In many cases, the answer is a clear yes. Dropbox or Macro Reflect, for example, are tools that I installed and indeed are things I want running from the moment I log on. In cases where it isn't clear, you might take a few minutes to research the tool, particularly if Task Manager indicates that the startup impact is high. Right-click on the item and you'll find a search online option that is a good place to start. Acro Tray is an example of a tool that's been around for ages and most people feel doesn't need to run at startup, if ever. It's associated with Adobe Acrobat Reader. Most research will clearly tell you that it can be safely disabled. If you're still not sure about an item, you can safely leave it alone. As I'll discuss below, this is typically my recommendation. Generally, items in the Task Manager startup list can be disabled without serious problem. At worst, some program or feature will fail to work and you could return to the startup list and re-enable it. Disabling startup entries. Before you disable anything in the Startup tab, check the options for the associated application. Very often the application itself will have a Start with Windows or Run on Sign-In option that you can safely turn off without needing to resort to Task Manager's list. This is the preferred way as it also allows the application to make additional adjustments if any are required. If that option is not available, then it's easy to disable items in Task Manager. You can see that about half the entries in my startup list are already disabled. To disable an item, just right-click on it and click on Disable. If you decide you need the startup entry later, you can return to the list, right-click on it again, and click on Enable. Needless to say, since doing this affects startup behavior, you have to reboot to implement the change. Where's the anti-malware? One thing you won't find in my list is anti-malware. That's because I rely on Windows Defender in Windows 10, and it runs as a Windows service. Windows services are treated differently than startup items and are beyond the scope of this article. Your anti-malware or security software may have startup entries. Since we're talking about security software, be careful what you choose to disable or delete. At a minimum, research any security-related items you find to determine whether it's safe to disable them. When in doubt, don't. Some items are persistent. One annoyance I've encountered is that some programs are extremely persistent. You disable an entry only to find it reset later after you've run it manually or, more commonly, accepted an update. Unless the program is truly expendable, at which point I consider uninstalling it completely, I leave the startup item in place if it's going to be that persistent. Is all this worth it? In my honest opinion, no. In practice, this can be a lot of effort for very little return unless you're experiencing a serious problem and are trying to diagnose a solution. It's very tempting to want to have a lean and clean machine, and I totally understand that. The problem is that most of these startup items are minor offenders in the big picture. Some take up visible space in the notification area, but that's about as bad as it gets. Most use very little memory and almost no CPU. Most are nearly benign. That's not to say that many might be totally unnecessary, because, in concept, many, if not most, are. The services they perform could be designed so as not to require software to be resident all the time. The vendors have chosen to write their software this way. It's annoying and unnecessary, but it is what it is. In general, I don't think it's worth the time and effort to try and pare it down beyond the obvious. For links related to this article or leave a comment, visit askleo.com/16440. I'm Leo Notenboom. This is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.